Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's conversation and for demonstrating your commitment to equity and social justice by signing the Disability Inclusion Pledge. My name is Emily Harris. I'm Executive Director of the Disability and Philanthropy Forum. I use she, her pronouns, and am proud to be part of the disability community. I'm coming to you today from the unceded land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, now known as Chicago. As part of our commitment to accessibility, our speakers and I will each provide audio descriptions of ourselves. I'm a white woman with dark curly hair wearing a black and white polka dotted top. Behind me is a white and tan screen. My access needs are met today because we have CART captioning. For those of you familiar with our panel format, we're going to forego that today. We hope that many of you had a chance to watch or re-watch the conversation our keynote speaker today, Sandy Ho, had with our colleagues, Nuran Khan and Nikki Brown Booker, back in March of 2021. If you didn't, it's not too late. Simply sign in after this webinar as a member on our Disability and Philanthropy Forum website, and it's the first session listed under Learning Series. We have linked it in the chat, and it includes many issues that we won't be able to address in depth with our time today. We want today's conversation to truly be a conversation. I'm delighted to jumpstart the conversation with Sandy Ho, who will introduce herself in a moment. But before we begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items for today's session. There are two ways to access the captions today. Use the CC button at the bottom of your screen and choose subtitles or full transcript, which will pop up as a box on your screen within Zoom. Or to access the captions in a separate window, see the link to the external caption viewer in the chat. You're welcome to join the conversation at any time using one of three methods. Use the chat, raise your hand using the raise hand button in the reactions tab on Zoom, and come off mute when called on. And if the chat is not accessible to you, feel free to send your questions to communications@disabilityphilanthropy.org. We already have the questions that you've sent in advance, and we'll be starting with those. Right before Sandy's introduction, let's start with a quick poll question for all of you. And while people are answering the poll, Sandy, why don't you introduce yourself? And before you do that, I also want to wish you and our audience a very happy ADA anniversary week. And maybe you can tell people what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Emily, for inviting me back to this space and also for moderating today's session. And so just as an introduction, hi everyone, my name is Sandy Ho. I am the director of the Disability Inclusion Fund at Borealis Philanthropy. I use she, her pronoun. And by way of access, I will give an image description of myself. I am an Asian American disabled queer woman with short, dark, wavy hair. I'm wearing a button-up white shirt that has ladybugs on it. And the back of me, there's a yellow curtain. Although I am typically based on the land of the Massachusetts people, today I am coming to you all from the land of the Anacostans, or otherwise known as DC, where I've been here for the past 48 hours, a whirlwind trip, and part of that has to do with the celebration of the 32nd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so, it seems really not that long ago, and yet a completely different time. where it was 2021, where I was having this conversation, as Emily had mentioned earlier, with Noran Khan and the Disability Inclusion Fund program officer, Nikki Brown Booker, back in 2021. And at that time, it was prior to my role at Borealis. And so I would like to spend a few minutes together, just kind of briefly highlighting some of the areas where I have already seen in my 8 months in this role, some of the incredibly exciting transformation, and also where I believe there is room for continued growth from the vantage point where I'm now sitting at the DIF. And that framing is really informed by and at the nexus of grassroots BIPOC disabled by groups and philanthropy. So I'm going to highlight one area of exciting transformation and then another area of more growth to come and a learning edge where I believe all of us can continue on our own learning journeys in this area. So the first is what I have seen, which is leading with and by curiosity. And so what do I mean by that? Well, so I think that as the Disability Inclusion Fund, the DIF, has begun to increase in our own visibility, right? So we are now moving into our third year of grant making, and the increased visibility and the lifting up of BIPOC and disabled-led groups that we are supporting. Other peer funders, many of whom are in this audience today, in this ecosystem, are not only coming to this work with your own questions about how you all can do inclusive grant making, but also, where does an organization even begin in its own internal shift to be more disability inclusive? Some of the questions that my colleagues, both Emily and Nikki and I have gotten include, how is disability justice and disability rights different from one another? What are some of the resources to begin to do participatory grant making? Why is that important to disability justice and disability rights movement specifically? And it's really through these kinds of questions and wonderings and that act of showing up with humbled graciousness, to come to either the DIF team or to seek out the forum's incredible collection of funder-specific resources and tools on their website, which really to me has begun to signal the beginning of a sea change. Right? And so that has led to the DIF team having many one-on-one conversations with others in this space, and sharing the why and the how behind resourcing disability justice movements. And so what does that actually mean in terms of the work itself? Well, for me so far, it has meant the difference between still having to have a conversation about needing to prove, right, why we need to find disability work in disability communities, and still having to make the case that disability justice is integral to all forms of justice, versus the conversation, which I find to be really exciting, and where the transformational work is happening, about actually rolling up our sleeves, right, and really exploring what kinds of grants do actually support disability-like groups. What are the internal organizational policies that need to happen to help support this work, both internally and outward facing and in the grant making? Right, so what are the opportunities to fund, for example, disability at the intersections of other social justice movements? What would it mean, really, for philanthropy to actually have a generational strategy on disability justice in the same ways that this sector has responded to other areas of civil rights? And so leading by curiosity really signals that shift in understanding this work. What is the infrastructure and resources that are actually needed? It's the really bold and necessary momentum that then drives the impact grants can have on the communities, and in particular, the overlooked and too often under-resourced grassroots disability justice groups. So that's an area where a lot of the excitement has been happening so far. So another area where I think there is a learning edge for us is disability justice, rights, and inclusion really must continue to build upon, facilitate, and drive power into the hands of folks with lived experiences, including those who know firsthand the consequences of ableism and other forms of exclusion and discrimination. Right? And so I think just in my initial 8 months or so of observing and being in conversations with colleagues and like-minded people in philanthropy in this space, it's sometimes it can be so easy to almost forget what is that shared North Star for this work, both internally within our organization and outward facing when it comes to grant making dollars. So resourcing, right, and building relationships with disability advocates and grassroots leaders. When we are in really deep into our strategic planning, reflecting on new funding priorities, or launching a new hiring initiative for a leadership role, all of these activities should address and integrate disability inclusion in some way, not only because it is mandatory.
Sandy, we have an access issue, so just 1 second. For some reason, the Zoom captions have disappeared, but the external captioner is still working. So Anjali, if you could put the closed captioning link in the chat one more time. If anybody requires captions, for now, you'll have to look at them outside the Zoom screen, and we will be working to bring them back into Zoom. Thank you. Go ahead, Sandy. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. I think that was just an example of modeling access as a priority. So thank you, Emily, for that. And so, yes, what I was saying was sometimes, when our own foundation work and the tendency of siloing disability inclusion or justice funding can happen when we are deep into our strategic planning, the reflecting on the new upcoming funding priorities, or launching new hiring initiative or leadership role. All of this should address and integrate disability inclusion in some way, right? Not because it is mandatory by law, right, by the ADA, which has been the law of the land for over 3 decades, but also, and because it is part of best practices, right? But because actually people with disabilities are active contributors to a more equitable and just society. Right? So it builds upon the existing commitments of the work that we are already doing. And so the DIF is proud to support, right, only a very small, tiny slice of those movement leaders and some of these strategies, but also internally and in the way that our fund operates, it's intentional that the team is helmed by disabled, Black, and people of color who have come up through disability justice organizing and other community advocacy roles. So what I'm saying is, in other words, doing this work really must be about the both and strategy, rather than what I sometimes see in the sector, making the choice that is more quote unquote impactful, but might not be the goal, or the impact isn't defined by disabled people who are closest to the issues that we are resourcing. Right? And so the way that this work is made stronger is when the work that is actually happening internally is continued to be anchored by that North Star of building power, dismantling barriers to access to funding, undoing ableist policies just because that's the way things have always been done. So I know that I've said a lot there, but I hope that just those 2 points that I've made can sort of begin to serve as fodder for our discussion and the question to come, and really want to emphasize what Emily was saying earlier, and showing up with curiosity. We hope that you will be engaging in this conversation with us. And I will just quickly end by saying that I come to this work as first and foremost a disability justice community organizer. This is my first role in philanthropy. But the organizing principles that disability justice offers remain the same in this space. And so I look forward to continuing to welcome and re-welcoming people into this work, and at whatever place and point along the continuum of the learning journey that you are at. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily to moderate the rest of the time.
Thank you, Sandy. That's so much, and so much great ideas and thoughts to unpack. Before we start doing that, can we see the results of the poll, please, about how much our audience is already intentionally contributing, and the good old 80-20 rule, but the 80-20 rule is on the upside this time. And I think that goes to Sandy's point that there's a sea change. And of course, all of you as working at foundations who have signed the Disability Inclusion Pledge are leading the way. So 80% of you are already making a concerted effort to engage with the disability community. And if anybody would like to share experiences of how that's happened for you so far, we are really delighted to hear any examples. I know that there's some of you who I might even call on later, so get ready to talk. And feel free to put your cameras on as well. One of the things that I've noticed, and I just came back, as did I think some of you, from the United Philanthropy Forum conference. And well, I think you're right, Sandy, that, and it's certainly right in this crowd, that the recognition is completely increasing. I'd say it's philanthropy as a whole. We still have to continue to make that argument that disability justice, disability rights are completely consistent with all forms of equity, and that these are intersectional systems of oppression that we're trying to work with. So I see a huge push in philanthropy widely and generally towards racial equity, and I still see the word disability absent from the list when people are saying all of the things that they want to do to create a more equitable sector. So that's my Debbie Downer perspective to you. But we'll take what we can get, and we're really excited to see the momentum that is building. Sandy, to kind of warm us up and expand a little bit on what you talked about today and that you talked about back in 2021, there were a couple things that struck me in that conversation, and one that maybe you're saying doesn't need to happen as much today, which is kind of the fire extinguisher role that people with disabilities have played. And maybe that's a little bit of what I'm talking about when I say, yeah, it's there, and they all want to do it, but they keep saying, we need to not only favor heteronormative people and BIPOC people, and somehow the word disability isn't there, or the word ability is there, but not disability. So that's one piece that I think the disability community wants to move away from, that fire extinguisher role, and especially when people get called out for forgetting our community. But the second is really that question of how do you go beyond just saying we want to engage with you and we want to share power. What does showing up authentically and sharing power mean to you?
Yeah, great and powerful question there. I think that could be its own webinar session by itself for sure. But I would start by saying that we as a sector have been complicit and in some ways contributing to the trends of not only under-resourcing disabled-led groups and overlooking, in particular, BIPOC disabled-led groups who we have the research, we have the numbers on, who are most closest to the forms of injustice that we are talking about here, that, there is a historical precedent in philanthropy around disability that has framed it not as its own powerful disability civil rights movement that has been going on in the 60s, 70s, even prior to then, but more as a medical model, right? As a direct services, as the ways that we are thinking about fixing, quote unquote, disabled minds and bodies. Whereas it's not to say that direct services are not needed, but there is not an equitable balance of grant-making dollars of disability inclusion of disabled folks who are the civil rights leaders. And one example of this would be, actually consulting with disabled people and hiring folks, not just to do the quote unquote disability inclusion work or, to serve in the accommodation part of the organization, but across and up and down the organizational structure. I think that one way we can really recognize and just a concrete practice that we can all do is, if we are here to say disabilities at the intersections across every justice area, then that means there should be representation, there should be understanding across every portfolio area. There is an understanding of how this is impacting disabled folks and disability communities. Whether or not your organization is calling it that is one story, but the fact of the matter is this work is already having an impact, and disabled people are likely already leading on some of this work in the communities and in the field. I think that is where the sharing of the power is where philanthropy can really show up in solidarity with what is already happening. So to provide more access and opportunities to funding means we need to hire disabled talent and knowledge to identify and to help support the ways disability is across the intersection. Authentically sharing power is about more than just an advisory committee, which I know is a starting place. And that is a meaningful starting place, right? But then being transparent about saying, hey, this is an RFP that we would love your the committees of people with disabilities to help advise on. And then to help identify the gaps in, to say, we trust you, to know your own network best, to know the issues best, and then to help distribute this document and this opportunity to folks who may not otherwise have the opportunity or think about themselves in this work. And then in addition to that is, of course, paying people equitably for their work. And so I think the ways in which I've seen some of this kind of emerge within philanthropy is during the pandemic, for example, so many foundations and grant making practitioners have really evaluated the ways that they have approached the application process, right? Like, what does it mean to really get the necessary information, to not make it so burdensome, to make it more accessible, to be more nimble in rapid response funding. And I think those are practices that don't need to go away, not only because the pandemic has not gone away, but because this is the way forward. We are to be serious about making it more equitable and accessible for BIPOC and disabled Black groups.
Thank you, Sandy. And I'm realizing that we have in the audience a perfect example to illustrate another example of what you've been talking about. So I wanted to ask Stephanie Smith from Northwest Health Foundation, who apparently is in a room with 3 colleagues. So any of you who would like to join us and talk, hello, Northwest Health Foundation. Others, feel free to come off camera. But you've done some amazing work in engaging consultants around disability justice and then sharing your learning. And I wonder if there's anything you'd like to share based on what Sandy just said about this. I think of you guys as a best practice.
Oh, thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much, Sandy. It's been so great already learning from you and getting to spend a little bit of time together. Honored to get a chance to speak up a little bit because we are still learning every day. And so it's always a privilege and a little bit surprising when folks point out our work because we have done a lot and there's still so much that needs to be done on a regular basis. So I think, we've been doing this work now since, 2014, 2015. I think our initial piece was to really engage some local leaders, some local disabled leaders and try and learn as much as possible. And from this, we really took in the disability justice framework and have really aligned as allies with this framework and have really put this at the forefront of our disability justice work and our disability work. We created a small grants program to try and kind of infuse money into our community and into disability-led organizations. And we also have been working with consultants around the Disability Justice Audit Toolkit, which is an opportunity for BIPOC-led organizations to be able to really assess their practices and figure out where are they already doing work with the disability community and where do they need to kind of strengthen that work and actually look at their own practices and their own policies and infuse that work. Anything else you'd want to add?
I mean, I think, yeah, this is Jen Matheson, just saying, you know, yeah, I think Stephanie definitely captured it. I mean, I think for us, it's both, you know, how can we support the leadership of disabled BIPOC, you know, movements, organizations, and people in our community. But I think we've also taken this explicit approach, you know, as Stephanie's describing with the audit tool, to say, how can we be in conversation with BIPOC-led organizations to say, where are there opportunities for cross-movement work, you know, across reproductive justice, across, you know, immigrant justice, across, you know, movement for Black lives, like where are those intersections with disability justice movements? And so that's been our approach.
Sandy, do you want to say anything to respond? I know one of the things that has struck me about the way you're approaching this is that we often forget that adding this lens is going to make the other work more successful.
Right. No, I mean, to what has already been said about the work of Northwest Health Foundation, I cannot recommend the Disability Justice Audit Tool enough. It was developed and created and by leaders in the TJ movement, including Leah Lasky, P.S. Samara Sinha, and our Disability Justice ancestor, Stacey Milton Park. And so I think if it hasn't been already, I know, like, I think it's a resource on the forum's website. But just to add that, I mean, I can share some of the work, 2 examples of the work in which the Disability Inclusion Fund has begun to do this already. Is one is with the technology and disability justice funding opportunity that will be coming later on this summer, early fall, where we convene content and knowledge experts who were all people with disabilities on the issues of tech policy, on tech infrastructure, what is the role of disability rights in tech. And we asked them to create the RFP, just tell us what are the gaps that they have seen at the intersections of tech and disability justice. And so it has really been about trusting it and getting out of the way, quite frankly. Right. So even though we are a fund that is led by disabled folks, we are not the experts in all of the things. And that's not what, you know, we are here to say is necessary, but it is to say, like, trusting movement leaders who are the experts in these issues and areas is certainly an important step. And then the other is at Borealis Philanthropy, we also have the Black Led Movement Fund, which is held by my colleague, Julia Beatty. And next year, we will be exploring some special opportunity grants that are specific toward Black disabled led groups. Right? And this is an opportunity for both the DIF and the BLM Fund to do some furthering of our own political education analysis on this work. The need to course correct some of the gaps in our own, you know, funding practices, and to say, you know, let's improve those things that we are already doing, and ways that we can be more closely aligned with movement.
So thank you. And thank you, Northwest Health Foundation, for joining us. And I'm really eager to hear from others. We'd love to hear your questions, either about what you need from us, the Disability and Philanthropy Forum, our partners at the Disability Inclusion Fund, and from each other. This is a really wonderful community of people all trying to figure this out. And I want to mention that some of you are probably at the even earlier part of the learning journey. We have some of you who are doing so much to engage already, like the Northwest Health Foundation, WITH Foundation, and others that are on this call. And then some who are just beginning this process and may feel like, whoa, disability justice, wait, I just need to meet somebody who works in my local community. So please come off mute, raise your hand, let us know what your questions are and how we can make this a valuable conversation for you. I'm going to pause for a minute, have one of those uncomfortable moments where we wait and see if anybody's going to raise their hand. And then I do have one question that was submitted in advance. Cindy Escobar Alvarez from Doris Duke Community Foundation. Thank you.
Hi, nice to see you, and sorry to keep my video off. I'm a bit under the weather, but I just wanted to chime in to say that one of the many ways in which the DIP has been very helpful to us is by helping us establish connections. So those connections that we don't have to the community, you know, we've had a couple of discussions with Sandy, and Sandy, you've been so helpful in introducing us to who is doing what, you know, who is where, based where, and I think just keeping that discussion and just learning about what we are both working on or all working on has been very helpful to identify who we need to be including or who are we excluding.
Thank you, Cindy. And I know you've done some great work to make sure that people with disabilities are included in your panels as you're reviewing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I am not sure I can talk about that, you know, only because we haven't done it directly in my team. I know that we have done it to gain input. So we have done from property. Let me take a step back. So we have done actually some work not related to grant making, but some of the work that the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation does through one of its organizations, Duke Farms, is let me lower my hand, is we serve the public, and they are a centers for environmental stewardship, and they have consulted my colleagues with the disability community to make sure that the grounds and the facility is accessible, and not just accessible, but that all of the activities, you know, from gardening, their raised beds, where I think that without the input of the disability community, maybe wouldn't have thought, oh, of course, we know this is something that we can do to make sure everybody can garden. And so on. So that is, I would say, in terms of our grant making, we are really eager to learn more how we can and better engage, and are starting to do that really by conversation so far.
Great, thank you. Let's put up our second poll to get people warmed up here a little bit. And that question, does your organization have a disability advisory group? It looks like we're 80-20 the other way. So about 20% of our groups do, and we'll allow that to keep going while we go to William Wilson's question. William, please introduce yourself and where you're from.
I'm William Wilson. I work at the Duke Farms, the property Cindy was speaking of, under the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. It's nice to see everyone. And just to continue on the point being made, we are an environmental center here in New Jersey, and we get host anywhere between 150,000 to 200,000 visitors a year. And accessibility is one of our main emphasis, as Cindy said earlier. And I think we have just partnered with, over the past few years, the Lehigh Valley Center for Independent Living. And they're one of our main collaborators in looking at everything. And they had just done their most recent site visit last week for the first time in 5 years. And the first time they were here, they assisted us with looking at increasing access to our indoor greenhouse to make sure we have buttons in the right locations, and making sure different things in our buildings that are most visited. That was the first project they worked with us on about 5 years ago. This part now that we're working on as of last week was looking at more of the trails. So it come to our attention that 90% of our park benches were not accessible. So they were on wood chips, they were on grass, they were in areas that were too steep. We were using different features in our restrooms where soap dispensers were located, and the types of paper towel dispensers were in areas that weren't necessarily accessible, all up to ADA code, but ones that were not really taking into account just trying to make our property as universally accessible as possible. We even have the accessible garden plots that we put in, but the gate to get to them, the resistance needed to push the buttons down was beyond what should be for it to be as accessible as it can be. And so we are doing everything we can to make sure that we're engaging as many different groups as possible to get that feedback. And we too had talked about putting together an ad hoc visitor group that can get together and kind of go through the property with us and see the things that we are not able to see. And then my last point is, I think that the part we are still lacking is just trying to find those right communities to engage with. Like, I think that we will get organizations that will find us. You know, when you get as many visitors as we do, we're not really advertising, come here, because on a busy Saturday, we can get 2,000 to 3,000 people in one day. But just making sure we are letting as many organizations know that we're here and we want to be one of the most accessible outdoor spaces that you can go to. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. And, you know, I think just when you advertise that you are accessible and you're asking if somebody needs an accommodation to come to an event or something like that, you're doing an amazing, like, spread the word, we are welcoming kind of advertisement. Sandy, more to suggest to the question of how to make sure that you're really tapping and reaching all groups?
Yeah, you know, I think what I really appreciate and I'm delighted to hear, as William was just hearing this program, was that, you know, it is a part of the public space. And that means recognizing that people with disabilities as part of the public community also then, you know, have access to this. And in that sense, I think the way we can think about providing equitable access and all the different forms of access, as somebody who has a lifelong disability and has been in the disability community, you know, we are not ever going to, I don't think, and maybe this is a little bit of the pessimist in me, but to be able to meet every single access accommodation need, right? But that being said, it is also helpful to be transparent about what we're not able to provide. Like, that is also just as much of an accessibility accommodation, so that then visitors who do come can plan for themselves, right? Like, oh, okay, so that means I'm gonna have to, you know, maybe come to visit with an attendant, or might be a way in which I'm going to have to rearrange transportation. Whatever it might be, I think there is still this hesitancy or this tendency to perceive access accommodations as an etiquette, as like, oh, I can't get this wrong. And I'm here to say you can get it wrong and then learn from it, and then we can improve. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
That's a great point. I love that. And I hope it helps take some of the fear out for everybody, because yeah, we do get it wrong, and there are times that, you know, we just can't fix something that's external to our organization. I'm going to turn to a couple other questions, and thank you again, William and Cindy, for leading this. Everybody should feel free to show your faces if you're comfortable. Christy Troutman asks, we have a commitment to paying people with disabilities as advisors, and we're doing that more and more, but we struggle a bit with how to be fair and equitable in our payments. So she's curious if others have developed guidelines and parameters around payment. Does anybody want to share any guidelines or parameters they might have developed around paying advisors? And I can share that the Disability and Philanthropy Forum at least has set kind of a schedule internally, and I'm not going to quote the numbers because I frankly don't remember them, but we have a couple of advisory groups that we base payment on an annual basis, assuming that the advisors attend all the meetings, and then we're clear about how we will reduce that if they're unable to attend. And then we have a sort of basic scale for writers, for webinar speakers, for speakers who come to a longer conference and might be spending a day rather than an hour. So we've tried to at least set a scale that we adjust, and we frankly have had to thank some people who we wish would agree to serve in certain ways, but they have set their own rates that just are beyond and wouldn't be equitable for what we're able to do. But do others have parameters for that? And Sandy, anything you would want to add?
Yeah, so for the Disability Inclusion Fund, I am not sure that I would call it a guideline or protocol necessarily, but I would say just as a practice, right? For example, when we do invite the participatory grant making committee, consultants, or advisory committees, as a practice, we do see very clearly that we recognize for some folks with disabilities who are on Medicaid or other means-tested programs, that are life-sustaining, that are life-giving. Sometimes that accepting what we would call a competitive and like honoraria or a stipend can jeopardize, right, their access to basic healthcare, and that is, a system and infrastructure policy that needs to be modernized. That is also not separate from this issue, though, but there are ways, and I would encourage folks to learn how their own accounting or payments can work around and be more accommodating to this reality, whether that's through gift cards and a check, or whatever that person's preference, and always asking first would be my general advice.
Our wonderful tech person is noticing Ryan Easterly. You've unmuted a couple times. And I know that you are a strong advocate for this topic. Is there something you'd like to share?
Yes, and I'm sorry I'm not able to be on video right now. I too am feeling a little bit under the weather, but as far as with Foundation, and I can only echo everything everyone has just shared, especially about in the case of with Foundation, we too allow for alternative forms of compensation, specifically for the reasons Sandy mentioned. But as far as our guidelines, as a floor for compensation for our guidelines, we've established that all individuals with lived experience of disability must receive a minimum of $100 or at least $25 an hour. So that is our floor. And like Emily alluded to, we do have a sliding scale that the more involved they are with the project, the higher we expect that compensation to be. But our floor is that every individual receives at least $100 or $25 an hour, whichever formula results in the highest level of compensation, and that's our floor. And we are constantly adjusting that. And one of the ways we benefit from our advisory committee is we are frequently discussing different scenarios with our advisory committee to see how they feel and what they feel would be a livable wage, given the scope of work and the type of work we're asking individuals to do, or our grantees are asking individuals to do in their projects. So I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And let me, while you're unmuted, let me ask you to go a little further and talk a little bit about your experience with advisory committees, and to the 80%, 78% of our participants today who have not yet set one up. What advice would you have about getting started?
Well, I would say start the journey sooner rather than later. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. With Foundation has had an advisory committee since 2015. In that time, we've had 2 different models. So that's a nice way of saying we made a few mistakes in the beginning. We revamped, and now we're much happier with the current model that we use. And what are the differences between the first model and the current model that we used? We moved to an entirely virtual model. So all of our meetings are conducted virtually. We also enhanced our compensation piece for advisory committee members. We also added an education component. So not only are they advising us on our grant making, but they're also receiving training on how to be board members of other foundations, trustees of foundations. So they are receiving kind of additional education, additional training that will benefit them as they're working with other organizations in their communities. And I think ultimately, as Sandy has said earlier in today's session, I do view the use of advisory committees as an and proposition. So in the case of With Foundation, we also have individuals on our board of directors, individuals with disabilities on our board of directors, as well as within our leadership, within our vendor groups. But really, the advisory committee helps enhance our work because, as we've also discussed today, no one person, no one organization can know everything about the totality of the disability experience. And our advisory committee really helps hold our feet to the fire, really helps educate us on various aspects of disability and various issues within the community. So even though I myself have lived experience of disability, there are ways in which they continue to help challenge my perceptions of disability, the work we're doing, and help evolve it to better meet the needs of the community. So I would just say, start the journey now. Please reach out to the DIF, reach out to Emily to help connect you to folks. There are some things that I would be comfortable sharing in a peer-to-peer conversation that we can't necessarily share on a recorded webinar. But I know that Emily and Sandy will help you, connect you to the right folks, and we can have a lot of those peer-to-peer conversations to help you get started. But please start the journey. It really does help strengthen your grant making.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you so much for offering yourself up as a resource. We all continue to learn a lot from you and all the great work of With Foundation. I want to go to the other question that was brought in the chat and kind of relates to where Ryan talked about the sort of both and. And so Katie Pellissier asks how to create a safe environment for staff to disclose disabilities. And comments further, I'm sure we have a lot of internal expertise and lived experience, and that we aren't tapping into because we haven't created a space where staff feel comfortable sharing. Curious to know how to be most supportive of that internal culture shift. And as we socialize a broader definition of disability within our team, maybe some folks are realizing for the first time they'd fall under the definition of disability. And I want to tag onto that, Katie. Thank you so much for that question. A question that came in earlier from Joni Schwager via the registration form, although she is not, I believe, on the webinar today. She's with Staunton Farms Foundation and asked about how we prioritize behavioral health disabilities. That may be a good example of the kind of disability that people often don't include themselves in that list of the community. I'll just say my own disability is hearing loss. I acquired that disability 25 years ago, and it took me until 7 years ago when I really started working in the disability movement to self-identify and to recognize that this is a community that is incredibly welcoming and has taught me so much about how to ask for my own rights and how to empower myself to make sure that I can fully participate and bring all that I can to my work and to my communities. Sandy, do you want to talk a little bit about this question of how to create a comfortable environment where people start to self-disclose?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and which I agree with Emily, it's incredibly important. You know, and I would hope that this is not a new statement that I'm about to say, but in the context of COVID as a mass disabling event, is that yes, we should expect and will continue to expect more people identifying as having disabilities in whatever way, whether it's COVID related or not. And part of this does also mean that, you know, some of the disabilities are not apparent, right? So I just kind of use myself as an example. Yes, I'm a wheelchair user. Yes, I have a hearing loss. I am also somebody who identifies as neurodivergent, as somebody who is ADHD. And so what that has meant for me in this new role and learning to you know, understand the pace of the work and get to know Borealis over the past 8 months, it's been about also understanding how an organization where Borealis Philanthropy is completely remote, has always been remote since prior to the pandemic. Right, so that means a lot of our time is through Slack, it's on Zoom, it's you know, through all of the many 8 channels that we can reach our colleagues. But also, it's about practicing mind-body access. It's about incorporating that principle of disability justice, of sustainability of this work, means that we need to also sustain ourselves and our own body mind, to not just value it as a productive machine to, you know, produce and to be always on. But that means, you know, at Borealis, we don't have to have our cameras on all the time. It means that, you know, captions as much as possible are expected to be on during staff meetings, during one-on-ones, during team meetings. And, you know, we are encouraged to not have back-to-back meetings, that, you know, meetings, if possible, are set to 45 to 50 minutes to give people that extra 10 minutes, you know, on the hour to get to their next meeting or to make that shift. And so then we begin to see, right, that it's not about having folks necessarily disclose because of accommodation, but it's about the collective well-being of the team, of the organization, of the staff to show up and do this incredibly hard work that we are in and day out. And so I think another framing of disability accommodation and access is disability justice is about love. It's about being welcoming. I think sometimes we get hung up on the specificities of, you know, 42-inch doorways and the bathrooms are at certain heights. And yes, those standards are there for a reason and are important, but also to keep up with the day-to-day work of what we do, it's also about being flexible. It's about, making this work more humane, not just for ourselves, but then that has an impact and contributes to the way our grantees are engaging with us. So just one quick example would be, past winter, we had a org-wide winter break. So we had that message in our automatic email responses. And when I put that up, one of our grantees said, hey, because we saw what you did, that gave us the permission to do the same. And so we are also modeling behaviors and ways of being together for our grantees as well.
Thank you. We have just a couple minutes left. I'm so pleased that some of you have jumped in, and I will also say that on the disclosure issue, there's some resources on our website, some former webinars, and also a guide that Katie, I will send you after to how to ask the question in your surveys. It takes a lot of space. There are short ways to ask it. The more you can list specific disabilities and leave another line, the more people tend to recognize that they are part of this. And then to Sandy's other point, I just love that you offered joy grants to your grantees this year. I think that's just such a wonderful way to express that this is a community that we celebrate and that we all need joy in our lives, especially in this very, very difficult time. I also want to acknowledge, I feel like I've been beating on you people. Ask questions, come off camera. There are 30 of you who are here today on a virtual conversation about this important topic. And there's so many distractions, not to mention summer vacation. So we really, really, truly appreciate all of your participation. Sandy, is there like a one-word farewell you want to give, and then I will jump into our closing remarks.
Yeah, just to say to everybody here who took the time to listen and to learn together, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Emily. A question as simple as like, hey, we are curious about and not sure if, what are the disability groups that are working in X issue area. Happy to have that brainstorm conversation with anybody here. And just to kind of reiterate what Ryan Easterly was saying earlier, which is, it's not too late to start, but starting is the point.
Thank you all. We are going to be sending a survey that will jump to your screen right after you close the Zoom. There's also a link that will go into the chat. We're really curious to know how we can be a community for you to help as you're moving forward on the pledge. The next webinar in this specific series for pledge signatories will be November 3rd. You'll be in for a treat to hear from my colleagues, Gail Fuller and Emily Ladow. A repeat performance again. There is a webinar on our website, and we want you to come with questions so that we don't have to just talk ourselves. We want to hear from you. And as Ryan mentioned, we know that often these topics are hard to discuss in a big group. Do feel free to reach out. And also the survey includes some questions as to what's the best format. Are you interested in a listserv or other ways of communicating? So thank you again, and we hope to see you at future sessions.
Thank you so much. And this does conclude today's program. Have a fabulous afternoon, everyone.